The journey home. Sergeant Leah Matthews had been deployed for nearly 6 months, stationed in a foreign land where the air was thick with dust, and the sky was often painted in shades of orange and red from the setting sun. Every day, she woke up to the harsh reality of military life. Long hours, constant vigilance, and the ever-present fear of the unknown. The physical toll was immense, but it was the emotional weight of war that weighed the heaviest on her heart. Throughout her deployment, Leah had witnessed things no one should have to see. Friends lost to the chaos of combat, soldiers wounded beyond repair, and countless moments where the line between life and death was blurred. But Leah had always been the strong one, the one who kept her head down and focused on the mission. She wasn't just a soldier, she was a survivor. Now, after months of being away, the time had finally come for her to return home. The plane ticket in her hand, a small but significant reminder that she was going back to the place she had longed for, the place where her family, her friends, and the comfort of normalcy awaited her. As she stepped off the military transport plane and into the bustling airport, she couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and anxiety. It had been a long journey, both physically and emotionally, and now that it was over, Leah didn't know what to expect. Her duffel bag weighed heavily on her shoulder, a constant reminder of everything she had endured and sacrificed. The familiar olive-green fabric of her uniform felt both comforting and foreign at the same time. It was a part of her identity, something she had worn for years, but it also marked her as different. As she walked through the crowded terminal, she could feel the eyes of strangers on her, some curious, others judgmental. Military uniforms had a way of drawing attention, and Leah had grown accustomed to it. She wasn't sure what to expect once she boarded the flight home, but she certainly didn't anticipate what happened next. As she approached the gate and handed her ticket to the flight attendant, the woman smiled at her warmly. "Welcome home, Sergeant Matthews," the attendant said, her voice filled with a genuine kindness. "Your seat is in first class. You've been upgraded." Leah blinked in surprise. First class. She had never imagined that a soldier like herself would be granted such an upgrade. She had flown countless times before, always sitting in the back of the plane with the other travelers who weren't quite as fortunate. But this time was different. "Thank you," Leah replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. It wasn't the luxury she was used to, but the thought of a comfortable seat after so many months of discomfort was enough to make her feel a little lighter. As she boarded the plane and made her way toward her seat, Leah felt a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. She wasn't used to being treated this way. First-class passengers around her were dressed in expensive business suits, their eyes hidden behind designer sunglasses, their faces relaxed in the comfort of their elevated status. Leah felt out of place in her military uniform, the wrinkles and wear evident in the fabric that had been through so much with her. But she forced herself to sit up straight, to keep her head high. She had earned this moment, even if she didn't fully feel like she belonged. Leah found her seat in 3A, a window seat with plenty of space. She sat down carefully, taking in the plush leather chair that contrasted so sharply with the seats in the back of the plane she was used to. The seat was a soft embrace compared to the cramped spaces she had endured in military transport. Still, something felt off. Maybe it was the judgment she felt from the other passengers, or maybe it was the simple fact that she had never been treated with this kind of respect before. She tried to push the feelings aside as she adjusted her bag, settling into her seat. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the noise of the cabin and the chatter of other passengers wash over her. All she wanted was a few moments of peace, a break from the chaos of the past few months. But peace was fleeting. It didn't take long for her to notice a man approaching her seat. He was tall, well-groomed, and sharply dressed, the kind of person who clearly thought a lot of himself. His expensive suit clung to his frame like it was tailor-made, and his shoes gleamed in the soft light of the cabin. He carried himself with an air of entitlement that Leah had seen many times before, but never so directly. As he reached her row, he stopped, eyeing her with a mixture of irritation and disbelief. "Excuse me," he said, his voice thick with disdain. I believe you're in the wrong seat. Leah, caught off guard, looked up at him with confusion. I'm sorry, but I don't think there's been a mistake, she replied, holding up her ticket. This is my seat, 3A. The man glanced at the ticket, then back at her, a sneer curling on his lips. This is first class, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. You don't belong here. The words hit Leah like a slap to the face. She had heard similar things before, in different forms, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. She had served her country, fought for the freedoms that allowed people like him to sit in the luxury of first class, and yet here he was, questioning her right to be there. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Leah said, trying to remain calm. This is the seat that was assigned to me. The man wasn't listening. He was too busy glaring at her, looking her up and down as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. You're a soldier, he said, almost as if the words were a curse. You should be in coach, not up here with people who actually belong in first class. Leah felt the anger begin to bubble up inside her. She had faced prejudice in various forms throughout her life, but never quite like this. The man was making it personal, stripping away her dignity with every word he spoke. Still, she tried to stay calm. She had learned long ago that reacting with anger never helped. But this was different. This wasn't just about her seat. It was about something much larger. Before she could respond, a flight attendant arrived at the scene, having overheard the exchange. Is there a problem here? She asked, her tone polite but firm. The man quickly explained the situation, his words laced with frustration. This woman doesn't belong in first class. She's a soldier. She should be in the back. Leah braced herself for the flight attendant's response, wondering if she would back him up. Instead, the attendant turned to Leah with a smile. Sergeant Matthews, your seat is indeed in first class, she said, her voice filled with warmth. Thank you for your service. Sir, your seat is in 5A, just a few rows back. The man's face turned crimson with embarrassment. He muttered something under his breath, but didn't apologize. Instead, he huffed and walked back to his seat, clearly annoyed. Leah exhaled slowly, feeling the strange mix of relief and frustration. She had been right all along, but the encounter had left her unsettled. The rest of the flight would be long, and she had no idea how to shake the discomfort the man's words had caused. But she wasn't going to let this one moment ruin her journey. She would finish her flight, get home to her family, and leave this encounter behind. Or at least, that's what she hoped. A quiet reflection and an uneasy tension. As the plane ascended into the sky, Leah Matthews tried her best to push the unsettling encounter from her mind. Her gaze drifted out the window, watching the patchwork of earth and clouds beneath them grow smaller, but her thoughts were far from serene. The words of the man still lingered, an unwelcome echo in her mind. You don't belong here. It wasn't the first time she had been told something like that. Growing up in a small town in Alabama as one of the few black girls in her school, Leah had always felt the sting of judgment. She had been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed more times than she could count. Joining the military had been her way of proving them all wrong, of showing the world, and herself, that she could rise above the limitations others placed on her. But even now, after years of service and countless sacrifices, the prejudice she faced still had a way of cutting deeper than she cared to admit. Leah let out a quiet sigh, reaching into her duffel bag to pull out a well-worn journal. The leather cover was scuffed and faded, a testament to the countless nights she had spent writing in it. The journal was her sanctuary, a place where she could pour out her thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment. As the hum of the plane filled the cabin, she flipped to an empty page and began to write. June 14, 2024. It's funny how some things never change, no matter how far you've come or what you've done. I thought coming home would be a relief, a chance to rest and reconnect. But even here, thousands of feet above the ground, I can't escape the weight of what it means to be different. That man's words shouldn't bother me. I know who I am. I know what I've done. but it's hard not to let it get under my skin. I've faced worse on the battlefield, but somehow this feels just as heavy. Maybe it's because it's not about what I've done. It's about who I am. And no matter how much I give or how hard I try, there will always be people who see the uniform, the skin, the woman, and think, she doesn't belong. But I do belong, and I won't let anyone take that away from me. Leah paused, her pen hovering over the page. Writing had always been cathartic for her, a way to process the tangled mess of emotions that came with being a soldier, a leader, and a survivor. But today, even the words felt inadequate. She closed the journal and tucked it back into her bag, her eyes flicking around the cabin. The man from earlier was seated a few rows back, his posture stiff and his face set in a scowl. Leah could feel his gaze on her every so often, a prickle at the back of her neck that refused to go away. She didn't understand why he was still fixated on her. The incident was over, wasn't it? She had been polite, the flight attendant had settled the matter, and life should have moved on. Yet here he was, stewing in his own indignation. Leah leaned back in her seat, trying to focus on anything else. She reached for the in-flight magazine, flipping through the glossy pages without really seeing them. The articles on exotic vacation destinations and luxury watches felt like they belonged to another world, a world far removed from the one she knew. Her thoughts drifted back to her deployment, to the dusty landscapes and the faces of the soldiers who had become her second family. She thought of Private Jenkins, who had shared his last care package with her when rations were low. Of Corporal Diaz, who had taken a bullet for her during an ambush. Of Lieutenant Price, whose laugh could light up the darkest days. They were her people, her brothers and sisters in arms, and she missed them more than words could express. But with those memories came the darker ones, the ones she tried not to dwell on. The screams of wounded comrades, the deafening roar of explosions, the quiet sobs of a soldier who had seen too much. Leah blinked, forcing herself to focus on the present. This wasn't the time or place to get lost in the past. The soft chime of the flight attendant's announcement broke through her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be serving refreshments shortly. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable." Leah glanced out the window again, the endless expanse of sky reminding her of the vastness of the world, and her small place within it. She had faced so much in her life, but she had always found a way to move forward. She wasn't going to let one man's ignorance derail her now. As the flight attendant approached with the drink cart, Leah smiled politely and ordered a coffee. She needed something to ground her, something warm and familiar to hold on to. As the cup was placed in front of her, she noticed the man from earlier glaring at her again, his expression a mix of irritation and something else. Shame, perhaps. Leah wasn't sure what to make of it. Part of her wanted to confront him, to demand to know why he felt the need to make her feel small. But another part of her, the part that had learned patience and restraint through years of military discipline, told her to let it go. People like him didn't change because of arguments or accusations. They changed because they were forced to see the world differently. And maybe, just maybe, she could be the catalyst for that change. Leah reached into her bag again, pulling out a small notepad. She had carried it with her during her deployment, jotting down thoughts and messages when the weight of the world felt too heavy. Now she used it to write something entirely different. "Dear Sir, I understand that our earlier encounter may have been uncomfortable for both of us, and I wanted to take a moment to address it. I am a soldier. I have served my country with honor and dedication, not because I seek recognition or special treatment, but because I believe in the principles this country stands for: freedom, equality, and respect for all. Your words earlier reminded me that these principles are not always upheld in our daily lives, and that's okay. We are all human, and we all have our flaws. But I hope that one day we can look past those flaws and see each other for what we truly are, fellow travelers on this journey of life. Thank you for reminding me of the importance of kindness, even in the face of adversity. It is a lesson I carry with me, and one I hope to share with you. Sincerely, Sergeant Leah Matthews. Leah folded the note neatly and flagged down the flight attendant. "Could you deliver this to the gentleman in 5A?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. The flight attendant nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. As Leah watched the note being delivered, she felt a strange mix of nerves and anticipation. She didn't know how the man would react, but she hoped that her words would make him think, if only for a moment. For the rest of the flight, Leah kept to herself, sipping her coffee and staring out the window. She didn't expect an apology, nor did she want one. All she wanted was to plant a seed, a small spark of understanding that might one day grow into something more. And as the plane continued its journey through the sky, Leah felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Bridging the divide. The hum of the engines droned on as Leah watched the folded note being delivered to the man in 5A. Her heart beat a little faster, not out of fear but anticipation. She hadn't written the note out of anger or spite. It wasn't about getting even or proving a point. For Leah, the note was an opportunity, a chance to share a piece of herself and perhaps soften the edges of someone else's world. The man, who she now vaguely recognized from glances during the boarding process, hesitated as the flight attendant handed him the note. His face shifted from confusion to guarded curiosity. He unfolded the paper slowly, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. At first, his expression remained unreadable, but as he read further, something in his demeanor shifted. His brow furrowed, and his lips pressed into a thin line, as if he were grappling with something inside himself. Leah turned her gaze back to the window, giving him the space to absorb her message. She didn't need to watch him react. She didn't need validation. Writing the note had been enough for her, a way to release the burden of the earlier confrontation and redirect her energy towards something constructive. Still, she couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. Did he feel remorse? Did he even care? As the flight wore on, Leah leaned back in her seat and let her thoughts drift. The man's reaction wasn't the only thing on her mind. Her journey home was bittersweet, and while she longed to see her family, she couldn't shake the memories of her deployment. Images of her comrades flashed through her mind, their smiles, their laughter, their sacrifices. She thought of Private Jackson, the youngest member of her unit, who always carried a photograph of his little sister in his pocket. He had been so full of life, always cracking jokes and lightening the mood during tense moments. But one day, Jackson hadn't made it back to base. The loss had left a void in their tight-knit group, a reminder of the fragility of their existence. Leah closed her eyes, the memories coming faster now. She could still hear the crackle of the radio during missions, the sound of boots on gravel, the distant echo of gunfire. These memories were hers alone, and while they had shaped her, they also weighed heavily on her spirit. She opened her eyes again, blinking away the emotions threatening to surface. Now wasn't the time for tears. She was heading home, back to a world where those memories didn't have to define her. But even as she told herself this, she knew the scars of war would always be with her, visible or not. The man in 5A, meanwhile, seemed lost in thought. He had folded the note and placed it on his tray table, but his eyes lingered on it as if it held answers to questions he didn't know he had. Leah caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of her eye. He wasn't glaring anymore, and his earlier smugness had faded into something more subdued. After a while, he stood up and walked toward the back of the plane, likely heading to the restroom. Leah took the opportunity to exhale deeply, releasing the tension that had been building since the flight began. She took another sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth as it spread through her chest. A few minutes later, the man returned to his seat. As he passed her, he hesitated, glancing at her briefly before continuing on. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell Leah that the note had done something, if not to change his mind, then at least to make him pause. The hours ticked by, and Leah found herself reflecting on her own journey, not just the flight, but her life up to this point. Growing up, she had been raised by a single mother who worked tirelessly to provide for her and her siblings. Money had always been tight, but their home was filled with love and resilience. Her mother had taught her the value of hard work and integrity, lessons that had carried her through the toughest moments of her life. Leah had joined the military not just as a means to build a career, but as a way to give back. She had always believed in the ideals her country stood for, even when those ideals weren't always reflected in reality. Serving had given her purpose and pride, but it had also exposed her to the darker sides of humanity, both abroad and at home. Her thoughts shifted to her family, who would be waiting for her at the airport. Her younger brother, Marcus, had always looked up to her, and she couldn't wait to see his face light up when she stepped through the arrivals gate. Her mother, who had cried over every deployment, would no doubt embrace her tightly, as if holding her daughter close could make up for all the lost time. Leah smiled at the thought. It was moments like these that made everything worth it. The sacrifices, the hardships, the sleepless nights, she had fought for them, for their future, for the life they deserved. And now, after months of being apart, she would finally get to hold them again. As the plane began its descent, the cabin buzzed with activity. Passengers stowed away their belongings and adjusted their seats, preparing for the landing. Leah did the same, her hand steady as she secured her bag beneath the seat in front of her. She felt a sense of anticipation building, a mix of excitement and nervousness about what awaited her on the ground. Just as she finished, she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, Sergeant Matthews." Leah turned to see the man from 5 standing in the aisle, his expression no longer cold or hostile. Instead, it was hesitant, almost apologetic. He held the folded note in his hand, gripping it tightly as if it were a lifeline. "Yes," Leah replied, her voice calm but guarded. The man hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I wanted to. Thank you for this," he said, holding up the note. "It gave me a lot to think about." Leah raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this was going. "I'm glad it resonated with you," she said carefully. "I wasn't sure how it would be received." The man nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I owe you an apology. For what I said earlier, it was wrong of me to make assumptions about you, about your place here. I don't have an excuse, but I wanted to say I'm sorry." Leah studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the way he struggled to find the right words. It wasn't easy for people to admit they were wrong, and she respected the effort it took. "Apology accepted," she said finally, her tone softening. "It takes courage to own up to our mistakes." The man looked up, relief washing over his face. "Thank you. My name is David, by the way. David Collins." "Leah Matthews," she replied, extending her hand. They shook, the brief contact bridging the divide that had seemed so vast just hours earlier. David hesitated again before speaking. "My brother was in the military," he said quietly. "He served in Afghanistan. He didn't make it back." Leah felt a pang of empathy. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her voice filled with genuine compassion. "I've lost people too. It's never easy." David nodded, his eyes misting over. "I guess seeing you in uniform brought up a lot of emotions I wasn't prepared for. I took it out on you, and that wasn't fair." Leah gave him a small, understanding smile. "Grief has a way of showing up when we least expect it, but it's never too late to channel it into something positive." As the plane touched down, Leah and David exchanged a few more words, their conversation lightening as they prepared to disembark. By the time they reached the gate, Leah felt a sense of closure she hadn't anticipated. What had started as a moment of conflict had turned into something far more meaningful, a reminder that even the deepest divides could be bridged with a little understanding. As David handed her a business card and wished her well, Leah felt a quiet sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better for both of them. A walk in their shoes. The plane taxied to the gate, and the familiar mechanical chime of the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Welcome to Atlanta. We hope you had a pleasant flight, and we thank you for choosing to fly with us today." The cabin erupted into the usual post-flight commotion. Passengers stretching, reaching for overhead bags, and checking their phones. Leah sat still for a moment, letting the noise and movement swirl around her. She felt both relief and heaviness. She was finally home, but she still carried the weight of the flight's earlier tension. Leah reached for her duffel bag, tucking the straps over her shoulder. She glanced back at David, who was standing a few rows behind her. Their earlier exchange still lingered in her mind, a strange cocktail of vulnerability, regret, and reconciliation. His apology had been sincere, but there was something else in his eyes, a pain Leah recognized all too well. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the sights and sounds of home washed over her. The smell of freshly brewed coffee from the airport cafe, the cheerful announcements over the loudspeaker, and the hurried footsteps of travelers all brought a sense of familiarity. Leah smiled faintly, knowing her family was just beyond the security checkpoint. But before she could get far, she heard David's voice behind her. "Sergeant Matthews." Leah turned, her brows lifting slightly. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon, but there he was, standing just a few steps away. He looked hesitant, clutching the business card she had tucked into her pocket earlier. "David," she said with a nod. "What can I do for you?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I know we've already talked, and I don't want to intrude on your time, but I was hoping you could spare a few minutes." Leah studied him carefully. There was no hostility in his voice this time, only earnestness. She weighed her options, knowing her family was waiting, but something in David's expression gave her pause. "All right," she said, adjusting her bag. "I've got a few minutes." David gestured toward a quiet seating area near the windows. The two of them walked over, settling into chairs that overlooked the runway. The silence between them stretched for a moment before David spoke. "I wasn't honest earlier," he admitted, his voice low, "about why I reacted the way I did on the plane." Leah tilted her head slightly. Her curiosity piqued. "Go on." David let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "My brother James, he wasn't just in the military. He was in your unit." The revelation hit Leah like a jolt. She straightened in her seat, her mind racing as she searched her memory. James Collins. The name sounded familiar, but in the chaos of deployment, names and faces often blurred together. "I didn't realize it at first," David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "When I saw you in uniform, I couldn't process it. James talked about you in his letters. He said you were one of the best leaders he'd ever had." Leah's throat tightened. Now she remembered. James Collins had been part of her team for a brief but intense period. He had been a steady presence, always willing to help, always putting others before himself. And then, one day, he was gone, taken by an ambush that had left their unit shattered. "I didn't know you were his brother," Leah said softly. "James was. He was a good man, a brave soldier. We all felt his loss deeply." David nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I blamed a lot of people when he died. The army, the government, even myself for not being able to protect him. And when I saw you, it just brought it all back. I lashed out because I didn't know how else to deal with it." Leah felt a pang of empathy. Grief had a way of warping the world, turning pain into anger and anger into blame. She had seen it in others, and she had felt it herself. "I understand," she said gently. "Losing someone you care about, it changes you. It makes you question everything." David looked down at his hands, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest of his chair. "I just keep thinking, if things had been different, if he hadn't been there that day, maybe he'd still be alive." Leah leaned forward, her voice steady but kind. "We all think that way, David. We replay the what-ifs and the could-have-beens. But the truth is, James made a choice to serve, to protect, to be part of something bigger than himself. And he did it with honor." David's shoulders sagged, as if a weight he had been carrying for years had finally begun to lift. "I never thought about it that way," he admitted. I've been so angry for so long, I forgot why he joined in the first place. Leah gave him a small, encouraging smile. It's not easy to let go of anger, but holding on to it won't bring him back. What will honor his memory is living in a way that reflects the values he stood for: kindness, courage, and respect. The two sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the airport filling the space between them. Leah thought about James, about the lives he had touched, and about the legacy he had left behind. She felt a sense of peace knowing that, in some small way, she could help his brother find closure. David broke the silence, his voice quieter now. Thank you, Leah, for everything. Not just for what you said today, but for what you did for James. He thought the world of you. Leah nodded, her eyes meeting his. And I thought the world of him. As they stood to part ways, David extended his hand again. This time, it wasn't a gesture of formality or obligation. It was a genuine connection, a bridge between two people who had shared a profound loss. If you ever need anything, David said, his voice steady but earnest, don't hesitate to reach out. I mean that. Leah took his hand, her grip firm but warm. Thank you, David, and take care of yourself. James would want that. As Leah walked away, her heart felt lighter. The encounter with David had been unexpected, but it had also been healing. It was a reminder that even in the face of pain, there was always room for understanding and growth. When she finally reached the arrivals gate, she spotted her family immediately. Her mother, tears streaming down her face, ran to embrace her. Marcus, taller and stronger than she remembered, pulled her into a bear hug that nearly knocked the wind out of her. You're finally home, her mother whispered, holding her close. Yeah, Leah replied, her voice full of emotion. I'm home. But as she hugged her family, she couldn't help but think of David. She hoped he would find his own version of home, one where grief didn't define him, but where love and memory could guide him forward. The weight of memories. The warmth of her family's embrace lingered as Leah Matthews walked through the arrivals gate, flanked by her mother and brother. The familiar sights and sounds of home, the chatter of travelers, the scent of coffee from a nearby cafe, the gleam of the airport's polished floors, felt surreal after so many months away. Yet, despite the joy of her homecoming, Leah couldn't shake the weight of the conversation she had just had with David Collins. The name James Collins echoed in her mind like a distant bell, reverberating with memories she hadn't revisited in years. James had been more than just a soldier in her unit. He had been a source of unwavering strength, a quiet leader who inspired those around him. His death had been one of the hardest blows Leah had endured during her service, a loss that had left an indelible mark on her heart. Leah, her mother's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. Are you okay, sweetheart? Leah forced a smile, nodding. I'm fine, Mom. Just a lot to process. Her mother gave her a knowing look, her hand resting gently on Leah's arm. We don't have to talk about it now. Let's get you home. The drive back to their small suburban home was filled with laughter and chatter, her family eager to share every detail of what had happened during her absence. Marcus had just been promoted at his job, and her mother had finally started the garden she had always dreamed of. Leah listened, nodding and smiling at all the right moments, but part of her mind remained stuck in the past. When they arrived home, the familiar sight of the white-paneled house with its neatly trimmed lawn brought a sense of comfort. Leah stepped inside, breathing in the scent of fresh flowers and baked goods. Her mother had clearly gone out of her way to make her homecoming special, and Leah was grateful. Later that evening, after the hugs, the stories, and the homemade dinner her mother insisted on cooking, Leah retreated to her old bedroom. The walls were still adorned with the posters and pictures she had left behind, a time capsule of her younger self. She sank onto the bed, running her fingers over the soft quilt her grandmother had made, and let out a long, shaky breath. Leah reached for her duffel bag and pulled out her journal. Flipping to a blank page, she began to write, her pen moving swiftly across the paper. June 14, 2024, evening. Today was supposed to be simple. Get on a plane. Come home. Hug my family. But life is never that simple, is it? Meeting David was unexpected. Hearing James's name again, that was harder than I thought it would be. I hadn't allowed myself to think about him in so long. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much. James was one of the best soldiers I've ever worked with. He wasn't the loudest or the strongest, but he had this quiet courage that made people trust him. When we lost him, it felt like losing a part of ourselves. I never told anyone this, but I carried guilt for a long time. I was the one leading the mission that day. I was the one who made the call to move forward. I know it wasn't my fault. I've told myself that 100 times. But knowing and believing are two different things. David's pain was so raw, so familiar. I saw myself in him. The anger, the blame, the endless cycle of what if. I wanted to tell him it gets easier, but does it really? Or do we just learn to carry the weight a little better? Leah paused, her pen hovering over the page. She stared at the words she had written, feeling the heaviness of the memories they unearthed. Closing the journal, she set it aside and lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. The next morning, Leah awoke to the smell of coffee wafting through the house. She made her way to the kitchen, where her mother was bustling around, humming to herself. "Morning, sweetheart," her mother said, setting a steaming mug of coffee on the table. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Leah replied, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong and comforting, just the way she liked it. Her mother sat down across from her, her eyes searching Leah's face. "You seemed distant last night. Is everything okay?" Leah hesitated, considering how much to share. She had always been open with her mother, but some things felt too heavy to burden her with. Still, she knew she couldn't keep everything bottled up. "I ran into someone on the plane," Leah began, her voice measured. "His name is David Collins. He's the brother of a soldier I served with, James Collins." Her mother's expression softened. "I remember you mentioning James in your letters. He was the one who—" Leah nodded, her throat tightening. "He didn't make it back. And David, he's been carrying a lot of anger and grief because of it. We talked a little, and I think it helped him. But it brought back a lot of memories for me too." Her mother reached across the table, taking Leah's hand in hers. "You've always carried so much, Leah. More than most people could handle. But you don't have to do it alone. We're here for you." Leah squeezed her mother's hand, grateful for her unwavering support. "I know, Mom, and I'm trying. It's just, some wounds take longer to heal." Later that day, Leah found herself going through the keepsakes she had stored away before her deployment. Among the photographs and mementos, she found a folded piece of paper tucked into an old notebook. She opened it carefully, her breath catching as she recognized the handwriting. It was a letter from James Collins, written during their last mission together. Leah had forgotten about it, but as she read the words, she felt the full weight of his loss all over again. "Sergeant Matthews, I wanted to write this in case something happens. Not because I'm scared, but because I want you to know how much your leadership has meant to me. You've taught me more than I ever thought I'd learn, not just about being a soldier, but about being a person. If I don't make it back, please don't blame yourself. You've done everything you could for all of us, and I wouldn't have wanted anyone else leading me. Tell my family I love them, and tell them I don't regret a single moment. Stay strong, Leah. You're one of the best. James." Tears blurred Leah's vision as she finished reading. She clutched the letter to her chest, her emotions spilling over. For so long, she had carried guilt and doubt, questioning every decision she had made. But James's words were a balm to her soul, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, she had done her best. That evening, Leah pulled out her phone and drafted a text message to David. "Hi David, this is Leah. I found a letter James wrote during our last mission. It's something I think you should read. Would you like to meet?" The response came quickly. "Leah, I'd like that. Thank you." Let me know when and where." As Lee hit send, she felt a sense of purpose. The road to healing was long, but maybe, just maybe, sharing James's words would help both of them take the next step forward. Healing through connection. Leah Matthews arrived at the small park she had suggested to David, her steps measured and deliberate. The sun was beginning its descent, casting golden hues across the landscape. Families played in the distance, children laughing as they chased each other around the playground. Leah carried James's letter in her bag, the weight of it more emotional than physical. David was already there, sitting on a weathered wooden bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. He looked different from the man she had first encountered on the plane, less tense, more subdued. His hands were clasped tightly together, his gaze fixed on the ground. Leah approached slowly, giving him a moment to notice her. "David," she greeted softly. He looked up, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with something close to gratitude. "Leah, thanks for meeting me." She nodded, sitting down beside him and setting her bag on the bench. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet rustling of leaves filling the silence. Leah reached into her bag and pulled out the letter, holding it gently as if it might crumble under too much pressure. "This is something James wrote during our last mission," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I didn't even remember I had it until yesterday. But I think he would want you to have it." David's eyes widened slightly as he accepted the folded paper. His hands trembled as he opened it, his gaze scanning the familiar handwriting. Leah watched as his expression shifted, the lines of his face softening, his eyes misting over. For several minutes, David read the letter in silence. When he finally looked up, his voice was thick with emotion. He thought so highly of you. He trusted you." Leah felt a lump form in her throat. James was one of the best soldiers I ever served with. He didn't just follow orders, he led by example. He made us all better, just by being there. David nodded, his hand still clutching the letter. "I always wondered what his last days were like. If he was scared, if he regretted joining. But reading this, it's like I can hear his voice again. Like he's telling me to let go of all the anger." Leah placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but comforting. "He wouldn't want you to carry that burden, David. None of us would. We do what we do because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. That's how James lived, and that's how he would want to be remembered." David's shoulders sagged, as if a weight he had carried for years was finally beginning to lift. "I've spent so much time being angry at the world, blaming everyone and everything for losing him. But you're right. It's time to let that go. It's time to honor him the way he deserves." The two sat in quiet reflection for a while, watching as the park began to empty and the sky shifted to deeper shades of orange and pink. Leah felt a sense of peace settle over her, a rare but welcome feeling. Sharing James's letter had been the right decision, not just for David but for herself as well. After a long pause, David broke the silence. "I want to do something in his memory, something that reflects who he was. Do you have any ideas?" Leah considered this, her mind turning over the possibilities. James believed in people. He believed in lifting others up, no matter the circumstances. Maybe something that supports veterans or their families. A scholarship, a fund, something that keeps his spirit alive. David's eyes lit up with determination. "That's a great idea. A scholarship for children of fallen soldiers, maybe." He always talked about how much he wanted to help others. "I think he'd like that." Leah smiled, feeling the surge of pride. "I think he would too." In the days that followed, David threw himself into creating the James Collins Memorial Scholarship Fund. He reached out to local organizations, set up meetings with community leaders, and began crafting a vision for what the fund could accomplish. Leah supported him every step of the way, sharing stories of James's time in the military and offering insights into the challenges faced by veterans and their families. As the fund began to take shape, something remarkable happened. David's grief, once a source of anger and bitterness, transformed into a driving force for good. He channeled his pain into purpose, using it to create opportunities for others and to honor his brother's legacy. For Leah, the experience was equally transformative. Helping David find closure gave her a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. It reminded her why she had chosen to serve in the first place: to protect, to support, and to make a difference in the lives of others. Months later, Leah and David stood side by side at the first official event for the James Collins Memorial Scholarship Fund. The room was filled with families, veterans, and community members, all gathered to celebrate the fund's launch. A large banner displayed James's name, accompanied by a photograph of him in uniform. David stepped up to the podium, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "This fund isn't just about my brother," he began. "It's about every soldier who has made the ultimate sacrifice. It's about their families, their dreams, and the futures they never got to see. And it's about carrying their legacy forward, so that their sacrifices were not in vain." The room erupted into applause, and Leah felt tears prick her eyes. She had seen David grow from a man consumed by grief to someone who could inspire others. It was a journey she was proud to have been part of. As the event wound down, David approached Leah, a look of gratitude on his face. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. Leah shook her head. "You had it in you all along. James would be proud." David smiled, his eyes shining. "And he'd be proud of you too." As Leah left the event that night, she felt a deep sense of peace. The pain of losing James would never fully go away, but it had found a purpose. Through David's determination and her own quiet resilience, they had turned grief into something beautiful, a testament to the power of connection, understanding, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. For the first time in a long time, Leah felt truly at home, not just in the place she lived, but in the life she had chosen to build. A legacy takes flight. After the event, Leah Matthews stayed behind to help clean up, her heart still heavy with the mix of pride and bittersweet memories. The James Collins Memorial Scholarship Fund had officially launched, and the energy in the room earlier had been electric. Families shared stories, veterans connected, and young scholarship recipients expressed their gratitude. It was everything she and David had hoped for, a celebration of lives lived with purpose and sacrifice. David approached her as she folded a tablecloth, his face still flushed from his speech and the applause that had followed. "Leah," he said, his voice quieter now that the crowd had dispersed, "can we talk for a minute?" Leah set down the folded fabric and turned to him, a smile tugging at her lips. "Of course. What's on your mind?" David hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward a quieter corner of the room where a few chairs were still set up. They sat down, and Leah could see the weight of something unsaid in his expression. "I wanted to tell you." He paused, taking a deep breath. "When James died, I was angry. At everything. The military, myself, and even the people who served with him. I told myself that if they had done something differently, maybe he'd still be here. It wasn't fair, but it was the only way I knew how to deal with losing him." Leah nodded, her expression understanding. Grief has a way of clouding everything. It makes you search for answers, even when there aren't any. David met her gaze, his eyes glassy but steady. "But after meeting you, after reading that letter, I realized I've been focusing on the wrong things. James didn't blame anyone. He wasn't angry. He believed in what he was doing, and he was proud to serve alongside people like you. I see that now." Leah's throat tightened, and she fought back the wave of emotion threatening to spill over. "He was proud of you too, David. He talked about you sometimes, said you were the one who always had his back, even when he was far from home." David smiled faintly, his hand gripping the armrest of his chair. "I didn't know that," he admitted, "but it means a lot to hear it." Leah reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "You've turned your grief into something incredible, David. This scholarship fund, it's going to change lives. It's going to carry James's name forward in a way that will inspire others." David's smile widened, the lines of pain on his face softening. I couldn't have done it without you. You reminded me of who James was, not just a soldier, but a person who cared deeply about making the world a better place. In the weeks that followed, Leah found herself drawn deeper into the work of the scholarship fund. What had begun as a gesture of support for David quickly became a passion of her own. She joined meetings with potential donors, shared her experiences as a veteran, and helped craft the vision for what the fund could achieve. David and Leah worked tirelessly together, forming a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to honoring James's legacy. Each scholarship they awarded felt like a step toward healing, a way to channel their pain into something meaningful. One day, as they were finalizing the list of the fund's first recipients, David looked up from his laptop with a thoughtful expression. "Leah, have you ever thought about sharing your story? About James, about your time in the military? All of it." Leah frowned slightly. "I'm not sure anyone would want to hear it." David shook his head firmly. "You're wrong. People need to hear it. Your story, James's story, it's powerful. It's the kind of thing that inspires people, that makes them understand the sacrifices service members make. It could change the way people see the world." Leah considered his words, the idea both daunting and intriguing. "Maybe," she said slowly, "but only if it's not just about me. It has to be about all of us, everyone who served, everyone who gave something of themselves." David grinned. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. Let's do it." A few months later, Leah stood in front of an auditorium filled with people, students, veterans, community members, and families of fallen soldiers. She clutched the microphone tightly, her heart pounding as she prepared to speak. It wasn't the battlefield, but it felt just as intimidating. She took a deep breath and began. "My name is Sergeant Leah Matthews, and I served alongside some of the bravest people I've ever known. Today, I want to tell you about one of them, James Collins." As she shared stories of James's kindness, his courage, and the letter he had written before his death, the audience hung on her every word. Leah's voice wavered at times, but she pushed through, driven by the knowledge that her words could make a difference. When she finished, the room erupted into applause, but it was the quiet moments afterward that meant the most. People approached her to share their own stories of loss and resilience, their voices filled with gratitude for her honesty. Leah felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years, a reminder that her service didn't end when she left the battlefield. The James Collins Memorial Scholarship Fund continued to grow, its impact reaching farther than David or Leah had ever imagined. Each year, they honored more students, created more opportunities, and shared more stories of the soldiers whose sacrifices had paved the way. For Leah, the journey was far from over, but she had found something she hadn't realized she was searching for, a way to turn pain into purpose, to honor the past while building a brighter future. And as she stood beside David at each scholarship ceremony, she knew that James's legacy was alive and thriving. In the lives they touched, in the stories they told, and in the unwavering belief that even in the face of loss, there was always hope.